The day I found out about the sale, the sun was gentle, pouring honeyed light over the marble countertop I'd once picked out myself. There was something cruel about the way beauty could remain untouched while betrayal spread like rot beneath it. I remember staring at the morning coffee, black and untouched, steam spiraling in the silence as I read the email from the lawyer. Not my lawyer. No, he hadn't even afforded me that respect. It was a cold, perfunctory message from a corporate representative, informing me that the property I'd inherited from my late grandmother, our vineyard in Sonoma, had been sold to a development group. A done deal. No consultation. No consent. Just gone. Erased with a few digital signatures. My hands trembled not with sorrow but with the kind of rage that simmers so hot, it turns cold. Nathan had done it. My husband. The man who wore tailored suits and smiled too perfectly at dinner parties. The man who told me I didn't need to worry about money because we were a team. He sold the vineyard, the last remnant of my family's legacy, while I was overseas finalizing a business acquisition. He thought I wouldn't notice. Or maybe he thought I'd forgive him the way I'd forgiven the smaller betrayals. The forgotten anniversaries. The hidden credit cards. The bruising words disguised as jokes. But this wasn't forgivable. This was war. He worked for a company called Lexhart & Chase, a mid-sized financial consultancy firm that fancied itself important. He wasn't a partner, just a senior consultant, but he walked like he was a king among clerks. I knew enough about their inner workings to know they were barely treading water. They'd made a few bad investments, let go of a few valuable analysts to maintain appearances. What Nathan didn't know, what he never cared to ask, was that my overseas trip had been more than vacation. I'd been finalizing the purchase of a quiet little firm in Zurich. Small but powerful. And with just the right influence to make a move. So I made a call. Took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of silence. I kissed him goodbye in the morning, handed him coffee with a smile, and watched him walk out the door like he still had a wife and a home and a normal life. Meanwhile, I set fires behind the scenes. I bought out Lexhart & Chase through a shell corporation, masked behind 3 layers of offshore anonymity. I let the partners believe they were being rescued by a mysterious investor with vision and capital. They were desperate enough to believe anything. And when the papers were signed, when the ink was dry and my name, my real name, was etched quietly in the controlling interest documents, I waited. I waited until he was called into the conference room. The one with the long glass wall and the uncomfortable chairs and the fake smiles. I was already there, seated at the head, dressed not in vengeance but in something worse. Elegance and black blazer. He froze in the doorway, confusion first, then disbelief and finally fear. I gestured to the seat across from me. "Sit down, Nathan," I said, my voice soft but absolute. "We need to talk about what happens next." He sat slowly, trying to collect the fragments of control slipping from his fingers. His hands rested on the glass table, twitching just enough to betray the panic. I slid a folder across the surface. Inside. Documents, screenshots, transaction records. I had them all. But at the top was the real knife. A printout of a message thread between him and a woman named Lacey. "Recognize the name?" I asked. His mouth parted, then shut again. He knew better than to lie. Lacey was his assistant. Young and pretty. I had suspected something, but the messages made it clear. It wasn't just an affair. It was a scheme. He'd sold my vineyard to impress her, to fund the down payment for a condo she didn't even know was in my name. It was all so disgustingly arrogant. "You sold my legacy," I said. "For her. For a fantasy." He opened his mouth and I held up a hand. "You're not here to speak. You're here to listen." Behind the glass, a junior HR rep waited nervously with an envelope in hand. Severance papers. Final paycheck. A letter formally terminating his employment. "You're done here, Nathan. And not just at Lexhart. I've made sure your name is toxic on every relevant hiring list from here to the East Coast. You wanted power? You had it briefly. Now you'll have to explain why your wife bought your company just to fire you." I stood, gathered my things and walked past him. As I reached the door I paused. "And Nathan, one last thing. That condo in her name? She'll be evicted by next week. Turns out I inherited more than land. I inherited strategy." He didn't move. Didn't speak. He just sat there, eyes wide, breath shallow, surrounded by the silence of a man who'd just realized he'd never truly known the woman he betrayed. And I walked out, heels echoing on the tile, into the start of my real life. The aftermath was quiet, surgical. The partners never asked questions. After all, I had saved their firm, boosted their portfolio, and stabilized operations. I kept Nathan's name out of public disgrace. Not for his sake, but for mine. I didn't need scandal. I needed distance. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silence after the storm, the hush of a boardroom where your name is spoken only with reverence or fear. I moved into a penthouse downtown overlooking the skyline. The place was glass and steel and silence. My kind of fortress. I poured myself into the business, turning Lexhart and Chase into a competitive force. Hired new blood, brought in visionaries, cut dead weight. The firm thrived. And beneath the surface I was building something even bigger. Something my grandmother would have been proud of. As for Nathan, I heard whispers. He tried freelancing, tried starting his own consultancy, even tried moving abroad. But the door stayed closed. Every job lead collapsed. Every client backed out. Reputation is everything in finance, and his was ruined without a single word from me. One night, months later, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. The penmanship was shaky. It was from Nathan. He wrote about regret. About understanding too late. About how he missed the version of me who laughed in the vineyard, barefoot and sunlit, not the woman who sat on boardroom thrones. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I admired that. Even in failure, some dignity remained. I didn't reply. Not because I hated him. No, hate is too noisy, but because I had no use for him anymore. He was a story I'd outgrown, a shadow I'd walked past. And so I folded the letter, slid it into a drawer, and poured myself a glass of wine. From a bottle grown in Sonoma, vintage 1983, my grandmother's favorite. I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker like a million possibilities, and I raised the glass to the night. To survival. To power. To never being underestimated again. Weeks turned into months and the world kept spinning. I settled into my role as CEO with a confidence I hadn't known I possessed. The team respected me. The board deferred to me. The industry began to whisper about the mysterious woman who had turned a floundering consultancy into a rising star. I let the whispers swirl. Mystery was a tool after all, a kind of armor. But even in the glow of victory, I found myself drifting sometimes. In quiet moments, I'd sit in the vineyard I bought back. Yes, I bought it back anonymously and restored every inch. It wasn't about wine anymore. It was about memory. About roots. The house was empty most days, but it smelled like childhood and eucalyptus, and it reminded me that everything stolen could be reclaimed. One day, I was walking between the rows of vines when a silver SUV pulled up by the old wooden gate. I didn't recognize the car, but I recognized the slumped figure inside. Nathan, tired, his eyes met mine through the windshield. I didn't wave. Didn't approach. I just turned and walked back up the hill. He didn't follow. He sat in the car for a long while, then drove off. And that was that. Later that week, I received a voicemail from a former colleague of his. Apparently, Nathan had been trying to start something, his own boutique firm, but without capital or reputation or connections, it never gained traction. He'd moved into a small apartment outside the city and started driving for a rideshare service. It should have felt like justice, but it didn't. He had built his world on borrowed power and broken promises. Eventually, gravity pulled it all down. On the other hand, had learned. Pain taught me patience. Betrayal taught me boundaries. And from that wreckage, I built a life not of revenge but of quiet dominance. A few years later, Lexhart and Chase was no more. Not because it failed, but because I rebranded it. The name held too many ghosts. The new firm, Aurelia Partners, had a cleaner image and a global reach. We opened offices in London, Singapore, Sao Paulo. And each step forward was a step further from the woman who had once stood barefoot in a sunlit vineyard, not knowing the war that awaited her. But I remembered her. I kept her photo in my office, tucked into the corner of my bookshelf. Me at 16, smiling beside my grandmother, both of us stained with grape juice and sweat, radiant in the Californian sun. That was where it started. That was what I fought for. One night at a gala in New York, I met a journalist who had heard rumors. "Is it true," she asked, swirling her champagne, "that you bought your husband's company just to fire him?" I smiled politely. No comment. Paragraph 40. But she leaned in, whispering, "If it is true, that's iconic." I didn't respond. Just sipped my wine and looked out at the skyline. Because in truth it was never about firing him. It was about reclaiming power in a world where women are so often taught to give it away. It was about showing that quiet does not mean weak. That grace can be lethal. That betrayal, when placed in the right hands, becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. And maybe, just maybe, it was about reminding every person in every boardroom that behind every quiet smile, there might just be a queen who's already won the game. So when people ask me now what I do, I tell them the truth. I build empires from the ashes of bad decisions. And sometimes I return to the vineyard. I walk alone, a glass of wine in hand, no longer barefoot but just as free. I don't need to look back anymore. I know what I survived. I know what I became. I am not the woman who lost everything. I am the woman who bought it back. So when people ask me now what I do, I tell them the truth. I build empires from the ashes of bad decisions. And sometimes I return to the vineyard. I walk alone, a glass of wine in hand, no longer barefoot but just as free. I don't need to look back anymore. I know what I survived. I know what I became. I am not the woman who lost everything. I am the woman who bought it back. That's the part no one sees coming. They expect tears, regret, or a plea for closure. But they forget. When a woman rises from betrayal with her silence intact, she doesn't return to who she was. She becomes something more. I built a company. I built a life. And now I sleep in silk sheets without a single compromise under my pillow. The empire stands tall. The vineyard breathes again. And Nathan? He's just a footnote, an old scar I barely feel. In the end, it wasn't revenge. It was restoration. It was justice served without theatrics, quiet, cold, and absolute. So if you ever find yourself on the other end of someone's ambition, remember this. You might bury her roots, but you'll never kill the vine.